Story 1. The Glitch in the Nightlight. Elias's life before the new apartment had been a comfortable slide into digital complacency. He was a software architect, a man who believed in code, logic, and the absolute predictability of the digital world. His 4-year-old daughter, Chloe, was the only beautiful chaos in his meticulously planned routine. The new apartment was in a restored 1920s building in a historically affluent part of the city. He'd ignored the eccentric building manager's rambling about previous tenants and low-frequency hums. The only thing that truly bothered him was the cold, which Chloe, with her unsettling childhood instinct, called the static man. Chloe had a simple, dome-shaped nightlight that projected a beautiful, slow-moving galaxy of blue and green stars onto her ceiling. It was her sentinel against the dark. The routine disaster began at 1:45 a.m. Elias was already awake, reviewing code for a high-priority bug, when he heard Chloe whimper. He went to her room. She wasn't crying. She was simply pointing at the ceiling, her face pale in the faint, swirling starlight. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice too flat for a 4-year-old. "The stars are sticking. He's taking the pictures." He looked up. The galaxy was beautiful and smooth. "No, sweetie, they're fine. Just go back to sleep." He tucked her in, but a creeping discomfort stayed with him. He retreated, but didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the rain outside and the silence inside. At 3 a.m., the silence broke. It was a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from Chloe's room, a dry, rhythmic, metallic click shink, like an old slide carousel advancing. Elias walked slowly to her door, pushing it open an inch. The star-field light was on, but it was behaving erratically. The blue and green stars weren't glitching yet. They were stuttering. The cool, hypnotic movement was punctuated by sudden, violent jumps, like a record needle skidding across vinyl. He squinted, trying to rationalize it. Faulty motor, cheap wiring. But the click-shink was relentless, and with every jump in the star field, the light on the ceiling momentarily seemed to warp, as if the atmosphere in the room was being violently displaced. He finally stepped inside the room. Chloe was asleep, facing the wall. He looked up. The stars were now definitely skipping frames, and in the millisecond of pitch blackness between the frames, his eyes, straining in the dark, caught a glimpse of something. It was an absence, a space that was too dark to be natural. He watched one full cycle. The light was on for 3 seconds, then a flash of blackness, then the light resumed slightly ahead of where it should have been. Click-shink. During the next flash, he saw the edge of a shape, not a shadow, because shadows are the absence of light cast by an object. This was an object that consumed light, a vertical pillar of absolute, perfect zero. Click-shink. The black shape was standing in the corner, tall and pencil-thin. Click-shink. The shape had stretched, its proportions becoming unnaturally long. It was now a terrifying, emaciated silhouette. Click-shink. Now the shape was moving. Its position had shifted to the foot of Chloe's bed. It moved only in the fractions of a second when the nightlight failed, covering impossible distances in absolute darkness. Elias's logical mind had failed. He was viewing a phenomenon that defied physics, a glitch in reality tethered to a $4 plastic lamp. He was trembling, his hand reaching for Chloe, but his feet were cemented to the floor by an ancient, instinctual terror. He felt if he broke the click-shink rhythm, the creature would be released from its temporal cage. At 3:17 a.m., the sounds changed. The click-shink became a slow, deliberate thump, 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 the rhythm of a heartbeat, or heavy, slow footfalls. Thump, thump, thump. The star field dissolved entirely. Now the light was simply flashing, blue, black, blue, black. During the black, the figure was now at the head of the bed, leaning over Chloe. Its face, if it had one, was pressed against the invisible boundary of the light. Thump, thump, thump. Elias saw the hand, not spindly, but massive, heavy, and disproportionate, slowly reaching down. He finally broke. He roared, a guttural sound of pure panic, and lunged forward. The nightlight gave one final violent thump and then went solid blue. The light was clear. The room was bathed in a gentle, unwavering glow. The figure was gone. Elias clutched Chloe, burying his face in her hair. He stirred, but didn't wake. He looked at the nightlight, the small plastic globe now steady, projecting a beautiful, unmoving universe. Then, from the plastic grate of the nightlight's speaker, a noise, low and distorted like a corrupted MP3 file, a whisper. Elias, she told me you like to watch. Elias. The voice was not Chloe's. It was deep and dry, but it knew his name. And then he felt a faint pressure on his ankle, an impossibly cold touch. He looked down. No one was there. But as he stared at the nightlight, he saw it. Projected perfectly into the center of the blue galaxy, replacing the largest star, was a single, black, motionless eye. It was watching him. The thump, thump, thump began again, not from the light, but from somewhere inside the floorboards, beneath his feet, ready for the next blackout.
Story 2. The Soundproof Silence. Arthur Pendleton didn't just dislike noise, he feared it. An early career in a deafening factory had left him with permanent, nerve-shredding tinnitus. Now a retired watchmaker, he'd poured his life savings into building the perfect quiet space, his basement workshop. It was a bunker lined with a caustic foam, reinforced concrete, and sealed by a custom triple-latch soundproof door. A door so effective that standing outside it was like standing on the edge of a sensory deprivation tank. Tonight, at 1:30 a.m., Arthur was in his element, surrounded by the beautiful, delicate ticking of dozens of restored clocks. He was deep in the heart of a difficult piece, a 19th-century French regulator. He inhaled, tasting the metallic dust and the faint scent of oil. The air was still. It was perfect. And then he felt it. It was a slight pressure drop, a fleeting moment where the air felt thinner, followed by a heavy, almost sticky quality. He paused, holding a pair of tweezers over a tiny gear. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud. It was low, almost below the threshold of human hearing, yet physically felt. A bass resonance that bypassed the ears and vibrated the bone structure in his skull. It was a whoom. Arthur's tinnitus was already a constant high-pitched whine. This new, deep sound felt like two different realities trying to occupy the same space. He stood up, walking around the workshop, his feet sinking slightly into the foam floor. The womb intensified, creating a distinct, sickening vibration in the floor itself. It felt like the entire house was sinking into wet clay. He reached the soundproof door and checked the 3 massive latches. All locked. The door was doing its job. The sound was not coming in. It was generating inside. At 2:05 a.m., the womb was so powerful that the tools on his workbench began to dance. A tiny spring oscillated until it flew off the bench. He had built a room to contain silence, and now that silence was being violently expelled. He realized the hum was alive. It was rhythmical, but irregular, like the deep, labored breathing of something unimaginably vast. He backed away from the workbench, his eyes scanning the room. The air was now shimmering. A heat haze, but cold. A visible distortion that began to pool in the corner farthest from the door. He looked for a source, a crack in the foundation, a failing appliance. Nothing. The sound was everywhere. As he watched, the shimmering distortion began to coalesce. It didn't take a shape that resembled anything living. It was a black, oily sphere that seemed to absorb all light and shadow. It pulsed slowly with the deep womb. He instinctively knew what it was. A pocket of pure sonic null. It was the true sound of nothing, and it had been drawn to the only perfect silence in the city, Arthur's soundproof room. At 2:44 a.m., the sphere began to expand, slowly filling the center of the workshop. Arthur pressed himself against the soundproof door, trying to make himself small. As the sphere filled the space, the delicate, constant sound of the clocks began to fail. Not suddenly, but one by one, their ticks became duller, flatter, and then simply ceased. The gears were still moving, the pendulum swinging, but the sound was gone, eaten by the void. When the last grandfather clock went silent, the sphere stopped growing. It settled into the center of the room, now shaped less like a sphere and more like a massive, shapeless black lung. And then it inhaled. It wasn't a physical suction. It was a cosmic draw. The womb cut out instantly, replaced by an absolute, perfect zero of sound. The silence was so profound that Arthur felt the pressure change painfully inside his skull. His eardrums registered only a deep, agonizing vacuum. He saw the thing in the middle of the room. It was not moving, but it was listening. It had consumed all the ambient sound and was now waiting for the only remaining source, Arthur's own body. He held his breath, desperately trying to quiet the frantic thumping of his heart, the gurgling in his stomach, the rush of blood in his ears, all of which were now deafeningly loud against the external void. He knew he couldn't hold it. His chest began to heave. He needed air. And as he finally gasped a ragged breath, the thing stirred. The black shape rippled, and from its center a hole opened, not of darkness, but of a color Arthur could not name, a blinding sonic absence. And from that aperture a whisper came forth. It was so quiet it felt like a thought placed directly into his brain, devoid of air or vibration. Finally, noise. You called it here, Arthur. All that beautiful, perfect silence was a dinner bell. Arthur didn't wait for the rest. He clawed at the 3 latches on the soundproof door, his bloodied fingers scrambling for purchase. He threw the door open and burst out, collapsing on the main staircase. The normal sounds of the house, the groan of the wood, the distant traffic, a painful relief. He never went back down. The workshop remains sealed. But sometimes when the house is still and the digital clock reads 2:44 a.m., he hears a faint woo that cuts through his tinnitus, and he knows that what he locked out of his life, he has now permanently trapped inside his home.
Story 3. The Mirror's Third Reflection. Alice Sterling's life was an exercise in rigorous control. She was an archivist at a major university library, and her obsession with order bled into her domestic life. The focal point of her apartment was an enormous, ornately carved vanity mirror, a family antique that took up an entire wall of her bedroom. Her midnight ritual, performed faithfully between 3:50 a.m. and 4:10 a.m., was a final, meticulous self-check. Hair, posture, clothing, everything had to be perfect before she surrendered to sleep. On a Thursday night, she stood before the mirror, satisfied with her flawless appearance. She looked at her reflection, tall, composed, and exactly where she was supposed to be. Then she looked past her reflection, into the reflection of the hallway behind her. It was in this third visual plane that the terror began. At 4:02 a.m., Alice noticed a flaw that simply should not exist. It was a disturbance in the light, a small circular ripple that clung stubbornly to the reflection of her white silk robe, precisely over her right kidney. It was the color of perfectly burnt charcoal, a stain on the silvered surface. She frowned. She turned, checked her robe. Flawless. She spun back to the mirror. The ripple was still there, a tiny, dark aperture fixed onto her mirrored self. She tried wiping the spot on the glass. Nothing. It wasn't on the surface. She pressed her thumb against the glass, directly over the reflected anomaly. She felt the cool, smooth surface of the mirror, but as she pressed, the dark spot pulsed once, like a tiny black heart. Alice's methodical mind snapped into a spiral of panic. This defied every rule of optics and physics. It was a three-dimensional object existing in a two-dimensional reflection. She moved away from the mirror, then moved back. The ripple tracked her movements flawlessly. It was tethered to her reflection. At 4:10 a.m., the ripple began to distort. It stretched into a thin, unsettling line, like a seam in reality itself. It grew, becoming a long, sinuous shadow that detached from her reflected robe and began to climb. It moved with the terrifying, jerky motion of stop-motion animation, traveling up her reflected back, over her reflected shoulder, and then it paused. It was now an incredibly spindly appendage, ending in 3 elongated, needle-sharp fingers. Alice stared in horror, utterly immobilized. The reflected hand began to tap gently on the smooth, reflected curve of her neck. She could hear the tapping, a dry tick, 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 coming not from the mirror, but from the impossible space between her and the glass. The reflected Alice, who had been a faithful, static duplicate, now began to move independently. Her eyes, the reflected eyes, began to dart back and forth, conveying a terror that Alice herself was only just starting to feel. The reflected hand tightened into a grip on the reflected throat. The reflected Alice's perfect, composed face twisted into a soundless scream. Her reflected body began to convulse, a frantic, mirrored dance of asphyxiation. Alice gasped, clutching her own throat. She felt a phantom pressure, a cold, crushing weight that wasn't there, but felt agonizingly real. The reflected self slowly went limp, collapsing with agonizing slowness into a crumpled dead weight against the mirrored floor. The spindle-fingered hand vanished back into the seam in her reflected back. Alice, the real one, fell to her knees, choking on air, her whole body shaking. She crawled backward until her back hit the opposite wall, staring across the room at the massive mirror. At 4:22 a.m., the mirror was calm. Her reflection was gone. In its place stood only the reflection of the hallway, and in the center of the glass, the reflection of a new figure. It was the original spindle-armed thing, but now it was standing in the mirror's foreground, perfectly still, looking out. It was impossibly tall and thin, its skin a dull, featureless silver that perfectly mimicked the backing of the mirror itself. Then the silver figure raised its own spindly three-fingered hand. It tapped on the glass, a loud, clear knock that echoed through the room. And it spoke. Its voice, a dry, flaking whisper that seemed to peel itself from the silver backing of the mirror. The other one was too loud. I prefer this arrangement. You are the vessel now, and I am the viewer. The silver figure smiled, a shallow, terrifying grin that stretched its silver face wide. It was wearing her face. Alice realized her reflection wasn't dead. It had been replaced, and the creature was now watching her life from the inside of the glass, controlling the image of who she was. She never broke the mirror. To break the mirror would be to let the silver thing step out of the glass and into her perfectly ordered world.
So she lives now, never looking at the mirror, constantly feeling the cold, three-fingered weight on the back of her neck, knowing that at 4:02 a.m. every night it is performing her nightly ritual in her place.